There were 3 decisive games in round 2 of the candidates tournament today. Let's take a look at all 3 of those games. So first of all, Levon Aronian against Shahriar Mamedyarov. You remember that Aronian lost yesterday. How would that affect his play today? Here he has a pretty regular position with the white pieces. And one could play quietly here, but instead he lashed out with f4. So, very interesting decision. One can play on the queen side with a kind of queen side minority attack with the pawns, but instead Aronian goes for it on the king side. So he's looking to push this knight away from g6 and then use the space that he's created behind that pawn to maybe generate an attack on the king side with his heavy pieces. Mamedyarov played his pawn to h6, forcing this bishop to exchange on f6. And Aronian continued with his plan of pushing the pawn and attacking the knight. And here, Mamedyarov dropped the knight back to e7, as we'll see, very careless indeed. He's still okay if he plays the queen to g5, threatening to take here and then with check, and then take the bishop. And then the knight comes to h4, and, well, this is probably playable for black. Instead, he put the knight back to e7. Now, normally this should be okay, but he overlooked a cunning tactic from Aronian, who played his knight into e4. This, of course, was taken. But now the queen is running short of squares. The only one available is to come to h4, but now the queen gets trapped. It's got no better square than h3. And after knight f2, the queen has run out of squares. The best that Mamedyarov could come up with was to give up his queen for a rook and then take on f5. Now, although Mamedyarov has a rook and a bishop for the queen, basically white has a winning position here, and, well, 20 or so moves later, Aronian wrapped it up. So what a shocking opening. Disaster there for Mamedyarov. So Aronian back in the fight. So let's move on to the next game. Svidler against Andreikin. Now, Andreikin had a decent start to the game, but Svidler fought back, and in this position, well, it's a bit unclear. You can see that at the moment Andreikin is a pawn up, but his pawns are ragged. This pawn on d6 is under fire, as is the pawn on c4, and the knight threatens the bishop on f5. So black under pressure here. Now Andreikin probably should play his bishop into e4, and after rook takes pawn, well, this is still an unpleasant position for black to play. Instead, he misjudged the situation, played his bishop to d3, looking to simplify, but after exchanging, Svidler came up with an excellent move. After knight f5, black is in dire straits. First of all, the threat is to play rook takes knight, and then a deadly fork on e7, checking the king and attacking the rook. That's the first threat. Of course, if the knight moves anyway, if it takes the pawn, then knight e7 is knight takes pawn, knight e7 is going to win. And if you cover the e8 square with the rook, then knight takes d6, another deadly fork, and that wins. This is probably already lost after knight f5. A really excellent move from Svidler. Andreikin tried to complicate with e4. Try and get these pawns rolling down the board, but Svidler calculated excellently. If the rook now moves up to c7, well, white is just cleaning up here. This pin is still very nasty, and this pawn is going to drop. Must be winning for white. Instead, Andreikin pushed with e3, and now we have a comical situation arises where black is pushing these pawns. They almost go the whole way, but Svidler has calculated it all out, brings the rook back, and now the threat is to play rook takes pawn. So the best that black has is to capture the rook and go into this rook and pawn endgame, but this is utterly lost. Svidler has 2 extra pawns, and in fact after this move, this very beautiful move from Svidler, Black resigned. The point is, if the rook takes the pawn here, then rook g5 check forces a winning king and pawn endgame, and if the rook goes the other way, then rook a5 is also deadly. Again, the king and pawn ending is completely winning for white. So after rook d5, Andreikin resigned. So let's move on to the next game, Kramnik against Karjakin. Now let's zip through these moves. Kramnik, with the white pieces, had a solid game in round 1, and it's Queen's Gambit accepted, I should say. And this is quite a theoretical line. I want to get to the critical moment. Kramnik said that he had prepared this particular line actually for last year's candidates tournament, but this was the first opportunity he'd had to play this. Now this looks kind of bizarre. In fact, f5 has been played in many games. In fact, Karjakin had played this in Beijing in 2012 and won a game against Ding Liren. Now most white players exchange here and then just play knight c3. Well, that's a perfectly reasonable way of playing the position. But Kramnik had prepared an improvement, or a new move at the very least. He played a3. Now hardly anyone has played this move. And here, Black could just push the knight back to d5 and then bishop f3 and the game goes on. But Karjakin said, and maybe that would be the pragmatic way for Black to play this position, but afterwards, after the game, Karjakin said, well, he felt he should play principally and take this bishop on e4. But I think this was a poor practical decision, because from this moment on, Karjakin comes under extreme pressure, and Kramnik was playing these moves practically instantly. Now Black's problem is, after this excellent move from Kramnik, that Karjakin has to block the check with g6, and you can see this creates terrible weaknesses on the dark squares around Black's king side, and it's very difficult for Black to defend these squares. White has a really easy attacking options here. Plays knight e2, can advance the h-pawn, can maybe bring the bishop into f6. Really difficult position, and Karjakin fell behind on time. Now, he attempted to blockade on these central squares, but this is still a very difficult position for Black to play. Now let me give you an example of this. So Kramnik's moves have been pretty simple. He's just developed, he's brought his king to complete safety here. Compare it with Black's king, which doesn't find safety on the king side when there are these weakened squares, doesn't find safety on the queen side when there's a pawn on prise here. And in the meantime, White has simple attacking options. Well, it's White's move here. I was considering bishop g5 to get the bishop into f6. I was also looking at h4. I think this is a reasonable idea to push, to break open the kingside position. You could also simply take back this pawn on the middle of the board. Also, I think gives White good attacking options. And there's this move, which Kramnik played in the game, and I think a very powerful move indeed. Stops any counterplay with a5, prepares to bring the rook over to c5 to attack Black's queen, which is kind of holding Black's position together at the moment. So Black has to decide what to do with the king, because there is a threat of rook c5 and maybe e6 to get in on e6. So Karjakin decided to castle queenside. Kramnik could just take this pawn, nothing wrong with this move at all. But instead he played consistently with this move rook c5. And here I think he missed, or well, I don't know, he didn't miss it, but he played in a different way. But I think a really good option would be to sacrifice the exchange and take here. And if we compare this with the game, you can see that white brings the queen round to the queen side and can start attacking this king straight away. And I think this is terribly difficult for black to defend. I think that would have been even stronger than the game continuation, which was also pretty good. So c4 from Kramnik. Now what he wants to do, of course, is capture the pawn on e6. So knight takes c4, loses immediately to the check, and queen takes c4. And otherwise, if this pawn gets defended with a rook, then there's d5, and this is just absolutely crushing. So king b8, and Kramnik took the pawn on e6. So now white has a very dangerous passed pawn. So the rook came here, and Kramnik played the queen back to h3. And Karjakin has to take this pawn, otherwise white's pawns roll through. And now, very quickly, Kramnik decided to sacrifice the exchange. And Karjakin, short of time, took the rook. But things might not have been so bad if he'd taken this bishop. Now, I think Kramnik's intention was probably to do this. Now there's a pin here. And the best continuation seems to be this. I mean, this is still very tricky indeed. And if rook here, well, we're reaching a fairly level endgame. Now maybe Karjakin was worried about this position, but after rook here, it's perhaps not so bad for black. Likewise, this position isn't so bad. Kramnik could keep the queens on. I mean, maybe after knight e3, Karjakin was concerned about this and thought that this was still a very tricky position to play. But it seems as though black can still defend this position with queen here covering this pawn. It's very difficult, but it seems that black is hanging on. But anyway, after this move, Kramnik's attack was very powerful. Now, in the previous position we looked at, where I sacked that exchange, you remember the queen could come round into the attack. Now, this is Kramnik's only problem. His pieces look tremendous, but the queen, if he brings that into the attack, now that could be decisive. So black still has chances to defend here. But short of time, it was very difficult. Rook c1 from Kramnik. Rook a1 is also a strong possibility. So if we count up the pieces, Karjakin has a rook for a knight. But his king is very poorly placed. And, well, in practical play, I think this is so difficult to defend, particularly when you have very little time. And white's king, of course, Kramnik's king, completely safe. Okay, let's see how Kramnik did it. So threatening a nasty knight fork, and the knight spun round, so he's just going to take on c6. Now, I think it's better to keep the queen centralised, and this is still very difficult to defend, but at least the queen, to some extent, shuts out white's queen. But once the queen goes backwards, this is absolutely hopeless. Good move from Kramnik. So he wants to bring his queen either to the middle or to e2 to join in the attack. So this sort of forces the knight into c6. And now a check. Knight was threatened. King went back in the corner, and now queen e4. So the queen is now participating in the attack. An unpleasant pin. And now I thought that Kramnik would play something like h3, just to give his king an escape square here. Well, Kramnik did give his king an escape square, but played in this really forceful way, advancing with g4. Now sometimes this takes away the square from the queen once this knight is defended. I mean, later on he might be envisaging pushing pawn to f5. It seemed like an extravagant way to give the king some room, but, well, I think one of the advantages of this move was that it actually completely perplexed, confused Karjakin in his time pressure, and he reacted to this move with h5, but this was just way too slow. So now the rook came in. Kramnik never has to worry about back rank issues. I mean, I know this square is defended anyway, but he's now free to move the queen. Now that the g-pawn has moved, his king has a square. Black is just too slow to counterattack on the king side. And after this, he is utterly lost. If the rook comes forward, then the pawn advances, for example. So Karjakin gave up the exchange, but now he's completely lost. Kramnik's initiative continues. Of course, this can't be taken because of the pin. Bishop g5, putting more pressure on the rook, so Kramnik just undermining the support for the knight. And in this position, Karjakin resigned. The rook threatens the queen, and the rook is threatened as well. Complete collapse of the black position. What a powerful performance from Kramnik. Just, it shows, I mean, this is so typical of his play. When he gets it right, when he hits, it looks so forceful. So after 2 rounds, Kramnik, Svidler and Anand all have 1.5 points. I should say that Anand drew very comfortably with Topalov. So Kramnik, Svidler, Anand with 1.5, Aronian and Topalov with 1 point. 12 rounds to go. Thanks for watching.